Trump's visit to China because I guess there were like warning shots that weren't picked up maybe or something. I'm not sure, but I would like to see what they're talking about the visit.
I'm joined now by Graham Allison, a professor of government at Harvard's Kennedy School. Professor,
Harvard,
thank you so
big
much
dick
for your
swinging
time
Harvard up in here.
So, in his public comments yesterday, President Xi once again referenced a theory you popularized called the Thucydides trap. Can you briefly explain that theory for our viewers and why the Chinese continue to bring it up?
Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. So Thucydides was the founder and father of history. He wrote a famous book about 2,000 years ago called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And in it, he explains that when a rapidly rising power, like Athens, he was writing about, threatens to displace and establish ruling power, that creates a dynamic that typically ends in war. I wrote a book about this called Destined for War, which I looked at the last 500 years.
Yeah, and that's Trump in China, totally.
Instances,
or America in China, not just Trump.
A rapidly rising power threatened a major ruling power. Think, for example, the rise of Germany in the period after reunification prior to 1914 and the impact that this had on the British Empire. 12 of these cases ended in war, 4 in no war. So war is not inevitable, but war is the natural outcome of the structural dynamic that occurs when a rapidly rising China, for example, threatens a colossal ruling U.S. on the other. And that's the challenge, that's the underlying problem for the relationship between the U.S. and China, and why it's so important that the two leaders understand each other and understand how that dynamic could lead them to an outcome that would be catastrophic for both countries. And that's why I think that actually their meeting, even though there were fewer deliverables than most people expected, was significant and actually made a very good start on what is an effort to try to deal with a relationship which is inherently dangerous.
I love Trump's handshake.
All of that
it's so odd.
Should it be interpreted as a threat for the Chinese to invoke this, or would both sides have to act to avoid confrontation?
Well, the headline takeaway from the summit was their commitment jointly to try to construct a strategic, stable relationship. That will require dealing with dozens of issues that could become hotspots or triggers or provocations that would lead them to an outcome that they don't want. Taiwan is one of the most dramatic.
I was just going to say, I was like, I do not, oh God, if Taiwan becomes a proxy war, oh Jesus Christ.
Is another case, and what's happening in the war in Ukraine is another case. So the fact that you have the leaders talking privately and candidly, as they've been doing in actually phone calls and letters in between, about the fact that they each understand.
Yo, what's up, Mohammadi? I see you. I'm not sure if you're still here, but I see you.
That's capable of destroying the other. So if there was actually a full-scale war between US and China, we wouldn't be here. So that's the
golden man himself
to try to prevent that. And by talking about the ways in which this could occur and expressing their joint commitment not to allow that to happen, they're reducing risks for all of us.
And
well, that's great. I mean, doesn't it just make sense that war is worse than, being a collective? It just, I don't know. It's a hot take nowadays. I don't know.
Is there a risk of
it could be a hot take
in all this? Because the differences between these two countries is more than just an economic rivalry. So is too much accommodation also a risk?
A good question. Absolutely. So the reason why it's so complicated is you have two contradictory imperatives. On the one hand, a rapidly rising China that's seriously threatening to displace a major ruling U.S. That's the structural reality on the one hand that can't be denied. On the other hand, we live in a world in which if there were a war between the U.S. and China, a full-scale war, each of the countries could end destroyed. So how can you both compete on the one hand and nonetheless cooperate and coordinate on the other in order to ensure that the competition doesn't get out of control? That's the challenge that they were dealing with. And while it seems like a impossible contradiction. It's actually a contradiction that we learned to live with in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where we reached a détente. Détente didn't mean giving up on the fact.
I don't know what's going to happen with China and Trump, but I feel like America being the ruling power, like he says, America can't handle not being the ruling power, that I think they'd be willing to just hit the fucking button. I don't know. You know, depends on who's in charge, right? But it sounds like war with China would be absolutely awful. But China's in a situation there, maybe they could, I don't know, be more communist in a way, if that makes sense. Help other powers if they get major concessions to, like, I don't know what that would look like. More globalization, less nations, more cooperation, more working together, shit like that.
We believed we
I'm not sure. Probably not, though. That's probably too idealistic.
The evil empire. I worked for Ronald Reagan with enthusiasm.
And this man is a bright red strawberry. You are correct.
We didn't
It's
believe
actually
that
insane.
by agreeing that we would have a détente and that we would have arms control agreements and we would have a stabilization of the relationship, that meant giving up on the proposition that ultimately our society would prove a free society more successful than an authoritarian or totalitarian society. So I think it's the attempt to deal with this contradiction, which is complicated and which is painful, but is nonetheless the challenge that the two leaders face.
It is complicated.
Yeah. And the thing about authoritarianism in this context, I'll just throw this in here to make the video longer, is that we live in an authoritarian state as well. I know we like to say we have freedom, but we don't have freedom. And because you get only two major parties win, and those two major parties have one economic plan, and it's called capitalism. And capitalism sucks, and it's horrible for workers, it's horrible for living conditions. And under Republicans, no one wants safety benefits, large governments. But the capitalists fund the government through bonds and financing, and also lobby the government for what they want. And if that's not authoritarian, then I don't know what is. The only difference is you have a choice, a vote of that feels like freedom. But in China, or under communism, it's supposed to be the government, the nation owns everything for the working class. In other words, the proletariat overthrows the old bourgeois and becomes the class that runs the government, an authoritarian majority collective working class, and not a class of bourgeois capitalists. But that's not entirely China right now either. I wouldn't say they're the end communist model by any means. It's interesting what will happen to the world and if we'll survive. That's always a fun part. We're just getting started, at least for me. I'm just getting started. I would like to live another 10 years if possible. That'd be fun. At least 20, at least another 20 to 30. Can we do that, chat? Can we make it to 20 to 30 more years? Is that possible these days?